Music thrummed through the floorboards, vibrating against the soles of her cheap, pinching shoes. "Look at you," Caroline whispered, her breath hot and smelling faintly of expensive gin and lime. "Nobody wants you here. You're a stain on the upholstery." It was a familiar cruelty, easy to swallow, but then the frantic murmurs in the ballroom suddenly died. The ice clinking in crystal glasses stopped. Leo Rossi, a man who broke bones like snapping dry twigs, wasn't looking at the heiresses. He was walking straight toward the stain on the upholstery. Sweat pooled at the base of Maeve's spine, itching against the stiff, borrowed satin of a dress that was 2 sizes too small. The corset boning dug a sharp, unforgiving line into her ribs every time she drew a breath, so she simply tried not to breathe deeply. The grand ballroom of the Hotel Belvedere smelled like roasting meat, heavy gardenia perfume, and the sour tang of desperate ambition. It was an overheated box of predators wearing silk and tuxedo wool. Maeve stood near a massive marble pillar, pressing her shoulder against the cold stone. The chill seeped through her thin sleeve, a brief, sharp relief against the oppressive warmth of the room. A waiter walked by, carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes. Maeve didn't reach for one. Her stomach was already rolling, a tight knot of acid and cheap coffee from that morning. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuff mark on the toe of her left heel. It was black shoe polish, hastily applied in the bathroom of their cramped apartment 3 hours ago, trying to mask the fact that she was wearing 3-year-old pumps to the most exclusive syndicate gala of the decade. "Stop slouching," the voice was close to her ear, sharp and wet. Maeve didn't flinch. She just straightened her spine, feeling the satin pinch the skin under her arms. Caroline stepped into her peripheral vision. Her older sister smelled of Chanel and ozone. Her blonde hair sprayed into a rigid, immaculate wave that didn't move when she tilted her head. Caroline was wearing emerald green velvet. It caught the chandelier light like deep water. It fit her perfectly. Everything always fit Caroline perfectly, mostly because the Sullivan family's remaining credit cards were entirely dedicated to ensuring it did. "I'm not slouching," Maeve said. Her voice was flat, carrying the gravelly exhaustion of someone who had worked a 9-hour shift at a floral warehouse before being dragged into a corset. "You're shrinking," Caroline corrected, taking a slow sip from a flute of champagne. She didn't look at Maeve. Her eyes were darting across the room, cataloguing the wealthy, the dangerous, the useful. "You're trying to disappear into the architecture. It's pathetic. Then let me go home." Maeve rubbed her thumb against the side of her index finger, feeling the rough, calloused skin there. A thorn prick from yesterday had scabbed over. She pressed a nail into the scab, grounding herself with the tiny, sharp pain. "I don't even know why Dad made me come." Caroline let out a short, nasal laugh. It was a sound designed to carry, to sound musical to anyone standing more than 5 feet away, but up close, it was just grating. "He brought you because it looks good. Family unity. A widower with his 2 devoted daughters. It paints a picture of stability for the board." Caroline finally turned her head, looking Maeve up and down. Her gaze was clinical, resting on the frayed hem of the blue satin dress, the lack of jewelry on Maeve's collarbone, the messy, pinned-up knot of her dark hair. "It's just a shame you ruin the aesthetic," Caroline whispered, stepping closer. The smell of gin overpowered the Chanel. "Look at you. Nobody wants you here. You're a stain on the upholstery." Maeve swallowed. Her throat felt dry, coated in fine dust. She didn't argue. There was no point in arguing with gravity, and Caroline's cruelty was just a natural force in Maeve's life. It was a simple, brutal fact. The Sullivan family was drowning in debt, clinging to the bottom rung of the city's criminal elite by their fingernails. Caroline was the golden ticket, the beautiful daughter meant to marry up and save them. Maeve was the spare part, the warehouse manager, the girl who balanced the cooked books in a back office that smelled like bleach and old paper. "I'll just stay out of the way," Maeve muttered, turning her face back toward the pillar. "See that you do," Caroline said, already losing interest. She adjusted a diamond clip in her hair. "The Rossi family is supposed to send a representative tonight. If by some miracle one of them looks this way, I don't want your depressing face ruining the lighting." Caroline drifted away, seamlessly sliding into a group of laughing women, her face instantly breaking into a dazzling, hollow smile. Maeve let out a shaky breath, leaning her head back against the marble. The noise of the ballroom washed over her, a cacophony of fake laughter, the scrape of silver forks against china, the low, thumping bass of the string quartet playing a modern pop song disguised as a waltz. She felt a profound, heavy exhaustion settle in her bones. She just wanted to take off the shoes. She wanted to sit on her sagging mattress and eat cold takeout in the dark. She picked at the scab on her finger again. A tiny bead of dark red broke the surface. She watched it well up, fascinated by the stark color against her pale skin. Then, the air in the room changed. It wasn't a sudden silence. It was a slow suffocation of sound, like a heavy blanket had been thrown over a microphone. First, the laughter at the tables nearest the grand double doors sputtered and died. Then, the clinking of silverware stopped. The silence moved like a wave, rippling across the ballroom until even the string quartet faltered, the cellist dragging a discordant, screeching note across the strings before abruptly halting. Maeve looked up from her bleeding finger. The heavy oak doors at the top of the carpeted stairs were open, and the room was holding its collective breath. He didn't make an entrance. He simply arrived, and the room was forced to rearrange itself around his gravity. Leo Rossi walked down the carpeted stairs. He didn't strut. His gait was heavy, measured, the slow, rolling walk of a man whose joints ached, but who refused to show it. He was wearing a charcoal three-piece suit that lacked the shiny, ostentatious flair of the cartel boys and the stiff, uncomfortable tailoring of the old money bankers. It was matte, quiet, lethal. Maeve watched him from her corner, her breath hitching slightly, not from awe, but from a sudden, primal spike of adrenaline. The air conditioning kicked on, sending a draft across her bare shoulders, but she suddenly felt entirely too warm. Rossi was a broad man, his shoulders stretching the wool of his jacket. His hair was dark, cut short, entirely unremarkable, but his face looked like it had been carved out of something unyielding and then left out in the rain. He had a strong, slightly crooked nose, a shadow of dark stubble along his jawline, and a small, jagged silver scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He looked deeply, profoundly tired. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Two men flanked him, stepping back just enough to give him the perimeter he required. The silence in the room was absolute now. You could hear the faint, electrical hum of the chandeliers. Beside the ice sculpture of a swan, Maeve saw her father. The older man was pale, nervously dabbing a linen handkerchief against his sweating forehead. Across the room, Caroline had stiffened. Her spine was rigid, her chin tilted up, perfectly positioning her neck to catch the light. She looked like a mannequin waiting to be bought. Rossi scanned the room. His eyes were dark, flat, entirely uninterested. He wasn't looking at the glittering dresses. He wasn't looking at the faces contorted into desperate, ingratiating smiles. He looked at the exits. He looked at the sight lines. He looked at the shadows. Then his gaze swept across the marble pillar. He stopped. Maeve froze. Her heart gave a violent, painful thud against her ribs, knocking the breath out of her. He was looking at her. No, not looking. Staring. It wasn't a look of recognition or desire. It was the heavy, assessing stare of a man who had spotted something entirely out of place in his environment. A distance of 50 feet and hundreds of people separated them, but the weight of his attention felt physical, like a hand pressing flat against her chest. Maeve swallowed hard, tasting bile and cheap mints. She suddenly became hyper-aware of the loose thread hanging from the bodice of her dress. She became aware of the blood drying on her thumb. She wanted to look away. Every instinct screamed at her to drop her chin, to hide in the shadow of the pillar. But a stubborn, cynical anger flared in her gut. She was already the joke of the room. She was already the stain. She wasn't going to cower just because the apex predator decided to look at her. So, she stared back. She leveled her gaze, her jaw setting into a hard, unimpressed line. Rossi's left eyebrow twitched. Just a fraction. A micro-expression that barely disturbed the hard lines of his face. Then he started walking. The crowd parted for him before he even had to ask. It was pathetic, really, how quickly the ruthless elite of the city scrambled over each other to clear a path. Men pulled their wives back by the elbows. Waiters pressed themselves flat against the walls, trays trembling in their hands. He was walking toward the right side of the room. Toward the pillar. Toward Caroline. Maeve let out a slow, shaky breath, releasing the tension in her shoulders. Of course. She was standing 10 feet behind her sister. The geography of the situation had confused her. Rossi wasn't looking at the girl in the ill-fitting blue dress. He was looking at the emerald-clad siren standing in her line of sight. Caroline realized it too. Maeve watched her sister's back stiffen even further. Caroline adjusted her posture, offering a slight, demure angle of her hip. She practically vibrated with victory. Rossi's heavy footsteps ate up the distance. The squeak of his leather shoes on the polished marble floor echoed in the quiet room. Squeak. Thud. Squeak. Thud. He smelled like rain. That was the first thing Maeve noticed as he got closer. Not cologne. Just the stark, metallic scent of ozone, wet asphalt, and very faint, expensive tobacco. It cut through the sickening sweetness of the perfume in the room like a cold knife. He reached Caroline. Caroline parted her glossy lips, her voice dropping an octave into a practiced sultry purr. Mr. Rossi, it is an absolute hoe. He didn't stop. He didn't even break his stride. He walked straight past Caroline, so close that the draft of his movement made the loose strands of her blonde hair flutter. Caroline's mouth hung open, her welcoming smile freezing into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked like she had just been slapped. Rossi kept walking. 2 more heavy, deliberate steps. He stopped in front of the marble pillar. He stopped in front of Maeve. The sudden proximity of him was suffocating. Up close, Rossi was massive. He blocked out the light from the chandeliers, casting Maeve in his shadow. She stared at the knot of his silk tie. It was charcoal, like the suit, but with a faint, almost invisible herringbone pattern. She could hear his breathing. It was slow, deep. She didn't look up at his face. She couldn't. If she looked at his eyes, she felt like the thin, fragile veneer of her composure would crack, and she would embarrass herself by either throwing up or bolting for the service doors. The silence in the ballroom had shifted from anticipatory to completely horrified. A dropped fork at a distant table clattered against a plate, sounding like a gunshot. "You're bleeding." His voice wasn't a smooth, cinematic baritone. It was a rasp, low, slightly gravelly, the sound of stone grinding against stone. It vibrated in the air between them. Maeve blinked, her brain struggling to process the words. She slowly raised her eyes, tracing the line of his jaw, the rough stubble, up to his mouth. He wasn't smiling. "What?" she managed to say. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. She hated herself for it instantly. Rossi didn't repeat himself. He slowly lifted his right hand. His fingers were thick, the knuckles scarred and uneven. He reached out, not toward her face, but toward her hands, which were clutched defensively at her waist. He took her right hand. His grip wasn't tight, but it was immovable. His skin was warm, dry, and rough as sandpaper. He lifted her hand, turning her palm upward to expose her thumb. The bead of blood from the picked scab had smeared, a tiny streak of crimson against her pale skin. He looked at it for a long second. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket with his free hand. He pulled out a dark grey linen handkerchief. He pressed the fabric against her thumb. Maeve's breath hitched again. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity up her arm, settling as a sour, panicked ache behind her ribs. She tried to pull her hand back, a reflexive jerk of self-preservation. His grip tightened just enough to stop her. "Hold still." "It's just a scratch," she muttered, her face burning. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her. She could feel Caroline staring daggers into the back of her head. "I work with roses." "Thorns. It's getting on the dress," Rossi said flatly. "The dress is a rental. They expect stains." Maeve didn't know why she was arguing. Her mouth was operating independently of her brain, fueled by sheer, panicked adrenaline. Rossi finally looked up from her hand. His eyes met hers. They weren't black, she realized. They were a dark, muddy hazel, flecked with exhaustion and something cold and calculating. "It's not your dress," he observed, his voice barely above a murmur, meant only for her. He didn't sound mocking. He sounded like a detective stating a fact at a crime scene. "It pulls at the seams, and your shoes are cutting into your heels. You've been shifting your weight every 10 seconds since I walked in." Maeve felt a flush of hot, prickly shame crawl up her neck. To be noticed was terrifying. To be dissected was humiliating. "Are you done analyzing my poverty, or do you want to check my dental records too?" she snapped. The words were out before she could swallow them. Behind her, she heard a sharp, collective intake of breath from the people close enough to hear. Nobody spoke to Leo Rossi like that. Nobody. Rossi just stared at her. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. Maeve felt the cold sweat return, slicking her palms. She had just signed her father's death warrant. She had just ruined everything. She braced herself for the anger, for the violence that everyone knew hovered just beneath the surface of his tailored suits. But Rossi didn't yell. He didn't signal his guards. He let go of her hand. He didn't hand her the handkerchief. He kept it, folding the tiny speck of her blood into the dark linen and sliding it back into his pocket. "You look like you're going to pass out," he said. "I'm considering it," Maeve fired back, her voice shaking slightly now. The anger was fading, leaving only a hollow, trembling fear. "It would certainly get me out of here." Rossi's jaw ticked. For a fraction of a second, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the ghost of a smirk, instantly suppressed. "Let's go," he said. Maeve stared at him. "Go where?" "Out." He didn't offer his arm. He didn't make a grand, sweeping gesture. He simply turned his body slightly toward the double doors he had just walked through. "This room smells like dying flowers and bad cologne. I need a cigarette." He took a step. He didn't look back to see if she was following. It wasn't a request. It was gravity. Maeve stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds. She looked past Rossi's retreating back. She saw her father, his face the color of wet ash, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. She saw Caroline, her perfect face twisted into an ugly, mottled mask of rage and disbelief. "You're a stain on the upholstery," Caroline's voice echoed in her head. Maeve looked down at her scuffed shoes. Then she lifted the heavy, cheap satin of her skirt just an inch off the floor. She stepped away from the pillar. She walked past her furious sister, the heavy metallic scent of ozone lingering in the air, and followed the most dangerous man in the city out the door. Cold air slapped Maeve across the face the second the heavy metal fire doors clicked shut behind them. They weren't in a grand foyer or a beautifully manicured courtyard. Rossi had bypassed the main exits entirely, pushing through a crash bar into a concrete service stairwell that smelled of stale beer, industrial floor cleaner, and old damp. The sudden drop in temperature was a physical shock. The sweat that had been pooling uncomfortably under Maeve's corset instantly turned to ice. She stopped on the landing. Her lungs expanded, dragging in the harsh, unfiltered air. It was the first real breath she felt she had taken all night. A few steps below her, Rossi stopped on a wider landing that opened out onto a grated metal balcony overlooking the alleyway. He didn't say a word. He leaned against the rusted iron railing, turning his back to her, and reached into his jacket pocket. Click, clack. The sharp metallic scrape of a heavy lighter echoed against the concrete walls. A small orange flame flared, illuminating the harsh angles of his profile. He brought it to a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and snapped the lighter shut. Maeve stood frozen on the stairs, her fingers gripping the rough metal banister. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant, muffled thud of the ballroom bass through the thick walls and the low hiss of car tires on wet asphalt somewhere down below. She waited for the catch. Men like Leo Rossi didn't rescue girls like her from embarrassing social situations out of the goodness of their hearts. They didn't have goodness. They had ledgers. They had debts and leverages and brutal, calculated interests. By walking out of that room with him, Maeve knew she had just shifted herself from a background prop to an active piece on a very dangerous board. "You can take the shoes off." His voice floated up to her, rough and quiet, carried on a cloud of grey smoke. He still wasn't looking at her. He was staring down into the dark, trash-strewn alley. Maeve blinked. "What?" "The shoes," Rossi repeated, taking another slow drag. "You're leaning all your weight onto your right hip to keep the pressure off your left heel. It looks painful. Take them off." A stubborn flush crept up Maeve's throat. "I'm fine." Rossi finally turned his head. The dim, sickly yellow glow of a street lamp from the alley caught the silver scar through his eyebrow. "Suit yourself. But there's no one out here to impress, and I don't care if you're barefoot. Your pride is just ruining your posture." It was the utter lack of mockery in his tone that broke her. He wasn't teasing her. He was simply diagnosing a mechanical problem and offering the logical solution. Maeve looked down at her feet. The pinched patent leather pumps were a localized torture chamber. Slowly, feeling utterly ridiculous, she reached down and popped the left shoe off. The relief was so immediate and profound, she almost groaned. She took the right one off next. She stood in her cheap, sheer pantyhose on the freezing concrete landing. It was freezing, but it was real. She walked down the remaining 3 steps to the balcony, holding the offending shoes by their straps in one hand. She stopped a few feet away from him, keeping a safe distance. The smell of his cigarette was harsh and sharp, cutting right through the lingering scent of Caroline's gardenia perfume that seemed permanently stuck in Maeve's sinuses. "Why did you do that?" Maeve asked. Her voice sounded thin in the open air, lacking the bravado she had managed inside the ballroom. "Do what?" "Walk right past my sister." Maeve gripped the railing, the rust flaking off against her palms. "She was practically gift-wrapped for you. My father spent 3 months organizing this so she could stand exactly in your sight line. Rossi flicked an ash over the edge of the railing. I know. Then why humiliate them? I didn't humiliate them, Rossi said smoothly, turning to face her fully. His massive frame blocked out the alleyway light. They humiliated themselves. Your father is a desperate man, Maeve. Desperate men are loud. They reek of it. Hearing her name on his lips sent a strange, uncomfortable shiver down her spine. It sounded heavy. He owes the syndicate $400,000, Rossi continued, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. He's been cooking the books at his import business for 2 years to hide it. Did you think a pretty girl in a green dress was going to make me forget basic accounting? Maeve's stomach plummeted. She knew the business was failing. She managed the floral warehouse side of things, watching the margins shrink month after month. But she hadn't known the scale of the debt. 400,000. It was a death sentence. So what? Maeve snapped, her fear rapidly converting back into defensive anger. You just decided to use me to twist the knife, to show him that you wouldn't take his bribe, but you'd take his garbage instead. Rossi's eyes narrowed. The faint amber glow from the cigarette cherry illuminated the sudden, sharp tightening of his jaw. He dropped the half-smoked cigarette onto the concrete and crushed it slowly beneath the toe of his leather shoe. He took a step toward her. Maeve held her ground, forcing herself not to step back, even as her heart hammered violently against her ribs. Don't call yourself garbage, he said. His voice was lower now, scraping against the bottom of his register. It's what they think, she shot back, her chin tilting up. It's what the whole room thought. You walking out with me was a punchline. I don't make jokes, Rossi said. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating off his suit. I walked out with you because you were the only person in that room who wasn't trying to sell me something. You were standing there, bleeding into a rented dress, looking like you wanted to burn the building down. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second, before his thumb brushed lightly against her bare shoulder. The contrast of his rough, warm skin against the freezing cold of her flesh was a violent sensory spike. I liked the view, he murmured. Before Maeve could process the shock of the contact or the heavy implication of his words, a heavy steel door at the bottom of the alley screeched open. Boss, a man in a dark overcoat, stepped out into the rain that had just begun to fall. He didn't look up, merely standing by the open rear door of a massive matte black sedan that had silently pulled into the alley. Rossi dropped his hand. The spell, or whatever strange, terrifying vacuum they had just been standing in, shattered. Your feet are freezing, Rossi said, slipping back into his cold, pragmatic baseline. Get in the car. Rain started spitting from the low, bruised clouds before they reached the curb. Heavy, fat drops that smacked against the concrete. Maeve scrambled into the back seat of the sedan, clutching her shoes to her chest, acutely aware of how absurd she looked. Rossi slid in beside her. The heavy door closed with a muted, solid thud that instantly severed them from the outside world. The interior of the car was a sensory deprivation chamber. There was no engine noise, no sound of the rain hitting the roof, no distant sirens. It smelled of rich, dark leather and the faint trace of peppermint. The seats were expansive, swallowing Maeve's slight frame. The driver, a wide-shouldered man with a neck thicker than Maeve's thigh, didn't look in the rearview mirror. He just shifted the car into gear, and it glided forward with terrifying smoothness. Where are we going? Maeve asked, her voice sounding too loud in the deadened acoustics of the cabin. I'm taking you home. Rossi reached over to the center console and adjusted a dial. A moment later, a wave of warm air blew directly onto Maeve's freezing, nylon-covered feet. She curled her toes, fighting the urge to let out a sigh of relief. My dad! We'll stay at the gala until it ends. Pretending everything is fine, Rossi interrupted. Your sister will spend the next 2 hours doing damage control, telling anyone who will listen that you forced yourself on me and ruined her evening. Then they will go back to their townhouse, and your father will drink half a bottle of scotch and try to figure out how many days he has left before my collectors break his knees. Maeve flinched. The blunt, brutal honesty of it felt like a slap. Do you enjoy this? Terrifying people? Rossi unbuttoned his suit jacket, shifting slightly against the leather. I enjoy order. Your father is a chaos agent. He borrows money he doesn't have to fund a lifestyle he can't afford, all to impress people who would gladly watch him drown. It's tedious. Then why didn't you just kill him? The words slipped out before Maeve could censor them. They hung in the warm air, toxic and heavy. Rossi slowly turned his head to look at her. The passing streetlights dragged bands of sickly yellow light across his face, illuminating the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes. Is that a request, Maeve? No, she said instantly, her breath catching. No, of course not. I don't understand how your world works. I balance ledgers for a flower shop. I don't know the rules of the syndicate. The rules are simple, Rossi said, looking away, his gaze fixing on the rain-slicked streets outside his window. You pay what you owe. If you can't pay with money, you pay in trade. If you have nothing to trade, you bleed. Maeve looked down at her hands. The tiny smear of blood on her thumb had completely dried. What happens to him now? Nothing tonight, Rossi said. Tonight, I just wanted to ruin his party. Silence fell over the car again. It wasn't the terrifying, suffocating silence of the ballroom. It was a heavy, complicated quiet. Maeve sat stiffly, her knees pressed tightly together, hyper-aware of the space between her and the man who held her family's entire existence in his calloused hands. She risked a glance at him. He was staring out the window, his jaw relaxed, his eyes heavy. He didn't look like a monster in this lighting. He just looked like a man who worked 90-hour weeks and hadn't slept properly in a decade. He's a killer, her brain reminded her frantically. He ruins lives. He breaks bones. But he was also the only person who had noticed. Her shoes were bleeding her heels raw. I live in the South End, Maeve said quietly, breaking the silence. Above the Sullivan Floral Warehouse, on 4th Street. Rossi didn't react with surprise. I know where you live. Of course he did. He held the mortgage, most likely. Caroline lives in the townhouse, Maeve clarified, feeling a sudden, inexplicable need to distance herself from them. With Dad. I moved out 3 years ago, when the business started. Slipping. When your father started stealing from the syndicate to pay for your sister's wardrobe. You mean, Rossi corrected effortlessly. Maeve bit the inside of her cheek, tasting copper. Yes. Then. Rossi finally turned back to her. His eyes dropped from her face to the cheap, synthetic fabric of her dress, to the bare, goosebump-covered skin of her shoulders, and finally to the worn-out shoes clutched in her lap. You manage the warehouse, he stated. It wasn't a question. You handle the inventory, the localized deliveries, the civilian bookkeeping. I do everything except the cartel drops, Maeve said defensively. Dad handles the special imports through the docks. I just sell roses and lilies. And you're good at it. Maeve frowned. I keep it running. It's not glamorous. Glamour is a liability, Rossi said, his voice dropping into that gravelly, quiet register again. Competence is rare. You kept a failing business afloat for 3 years with zero capital, while your father actively sabotaged it. He leaned slightly closer. The smell of rain and tobacco wrapped around her. I don't need another pretty girl in a velvet dress, Maeve. The city is full of them. They're cheap. Rossi's eyes locked onto hers, dark and absolute. I need someone who knows how to survive in a failing structure without complaining. The car began to slow, turning down a familiar, pothole-riddled street. The smooth suspension of the armored vehicle finally gave a slight shudder as it navigated the broken pavement. Maeve's heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs again. He wasn't talking about flowers anymore. "What are you saying?" she whispered. The heavy car rolled to a gentle stop. Outside her window, Maeve saw the flickering, neon-pink sign of the Sullivan Floral Warehouse, buzzing stubbornly in the rain. Rossi didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze stripping away the terrible dress, the messy hair, the poverty, and seeing straight into the tired, cynical core of her. "I'm saying," Rossi murmured, "that your father's debt is no longer my primary interest." Streetlights bled through the tinted windows, dragging bands of sickly pink light from the warehouse sign across the leather seats. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady drumming against the reinforced roof of the car. Maeve sat paralyzed. Her brain, usually quick to calculate inventory deficits and profit margins, completely stalled out. "Your father's debt is no longer my primary interest." The words hung in the warm, peppermint-scented air. They didn't feel like a romantic declaration. They felt like a heavy, iron cage dropping from the ceiling, slamming into the concrete all around her. "You can't just," Maeve stammered, her fingers digging into the patent leather of her discarded shoes. "You can't just transfer a debt like that." "I own the paper," Rossi said simply. He didn't move toward her. He didn't try to touch her again. He just sat in his corner of the massive back seat, an immovable object. "I can burn the paper. I can rewrite the paper. The mechanics of it aren't your concern." "They are absolutely my concern," Maeve's voice cracked, pitching upward in panic. "If you're looking for collateral, I don't have anything. I don't own the warehouse. I rent the apartment upstairs month to month. The dress is a rental. The shoes are—" She looked down at the scuffed black heels in her lap. 3 years old, and mostly glue at this point. "I have nothing you want." Rossi watched her unravel with infuriating calm. His face was a mask of carved stone, entirely unaffected by her sudden, frantic energy. "You're panicking," he observed. "I am being kidnapped in slow motion," she practically yelled, gesturing wildly at the locked, bulletproof doors. "The door is unlocked, Maeve." She froze, her arm suspended in midair. "Bruno unlocked the doors the second we put the car in park," Rossi continued, his voice low, steady, entirely devoid of threat. "You are free to open it. You are free to walk up to your apartment, take off that ridiculous corset, and go to sleep. I'm not a monster under your bed." Maeve slowly lowered her arm. She glanced at the heavy chrome door handle. It looked miles away. "Then what do you want?" she asked, her voice dropping back to a raspy whisper. "People like you don't do favors. If my dad's debt isn't the interest, what is?" Rossi shifted his weight, turning slightly toward her. The pink neon light caught the harsh lines of his jaw. "I want you to come to my office on Monday." Maeve blinked. "Your office?" "Yes, at the holding company downtown. 10 a.m. "To do what?" "To look at a ledger." Rossi reached into his jacket pocket. Maeve flinched reflexively, expecting a gun, a knife, something sharp. Instead, he pulled out a small, heavy piece of cream-colored cardstock. He held it out to her, pinching it between his scarred index and middle fingers. Maeve stared at it like it was a live grenade. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and took it. It was thick, textured paper. Embossed in the center was a single, elegant letter. "Ah." No phone number. No address. just the letter. My syndicates have operational leaks, Rossi said, leaning back into the shadows of the seat. Money is bleeding out of our shipping divisions. My accountants tell me everything is fine. My gut tells me they are lying. Maeve clutched the card. And you want me to look at it? I run a flower shop, Rossi. I buy bulk baby's breath. I don't know how to audit a cartel. You know how to stretch a dollar until it screams, he countered, his eyes locking onto hers. You know how to hide a failing infrastructure from aggressive creditors. You're cynical. You're exhausted. And most importantly, he paused, the corner of his mouth ticking up in that ghost of a smirk she had seen in the ballroom. You don't care enough about my men to lie to protect them. If they are stealing from me, you'll see it. Because you're used to looking for the rot. Maeve sat in stunned silence. The absolute absurdity of the situation washed over her. 2 hours ago, she was a piece of invisible trash hiding behind a pillar. Now, the most lethal man in the city was trying to headhunt her for a forensic accounting job in a criminal empire. And if I say no, she asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. If I don't show up on Monday? Rossi didn't blink. The warmth in his eyes, the slight amusement, vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, flat emptiness that made Maeve's stomach cramp. Then your father owes me $400,000 by Wednesday, Rossi said softly. And Bruno will be the one knocking on the townhouse door to collect. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't a snarl. It was a simple, factual statement of cause and effect. Maeve swallowed hard. The metallic taste of adrenaline coated her tongue. It was a trap. It was a brilliant, perfectly executed trap. He wasn't taking her hostage with a gun. He was taking her hostage with a job offer and a guillotine suspended over her family's neck. She looked at the card in her hand. The embossed R felt rough against her thumb. She didn't owe her father anything. He had ruined their lives. He had fed her to Caroline's vanity for years. But the thought of Bruno walking into that townhouse, the thought of the blood, the screaming, she hated herself for her own weakness. 10 a.m., Maeve whispered, refusing to look up from the card. Don't be late, Rossi said. And Maeve? She finally lifted her eyes. Burn the dress, he said quietly. It doesn't belong on you. Maeve didn't answer. She reached out, gripped the heavy chrome handle, and pulled. The door clicked open, and the cold, damp smell of wet garbage and wet concrete flooded the pristine cabin. She stepped out into the pouring rain, her stockinged feet hitting the icy, broken pavement. She slammed the heavy door shut behind her. She didn't look back as the massive black sedan pulled away, its taillights bleeding into the darkness of the wet street. She just stood there under the flickering neon hum of the Sullivan floral sign, shivering in the freezing rain, clutching the heavy cardstock in her fist like a lifeline, or an anchor. Monday morning tasted like burnt espresso and bile. Rain slashed against the tinted glass of the revolving doors at Rossi Holdings. Maeve stood on the sidewalk, clutching a threadbare trench coat around her shoulders, shivering. She stared up at the sheer, imposing cliff face of the skyscraper. Glass towers like this didn't belong to men who broke kneecaps for a living. They belonged to hedge fund managers and corporate vultures. But standing here, inhaling the sharp, metallic scent of wet pavement, she realized there was very little difference between the two. She pushed through the heavy doors. Air conditioning hit her instantly, smelling of expensive air purifiers and cold lemon pledge. Her scuffed practical loafers squeaked softly against the pristine white marble floor of the lobby. Security guards in tailored suits, men who looked less like rent-a-cops and more like linebackers, watched her approach with flat, dead eyes. "Can I help you?" a receptionist asked. Her voice was polished, dripping with condescension, as her gaze flicked over Maeve's thrifted blazer and wet, frizzy hair. Maeve didn't speak. She just reached into her pocket and slid the heavy, cream-colored cardstock across the counter. Recognition flared in the receptionist's eyes, fast and terrified. Her condescending smile vanished, replaced by a tight, bloodless line. She handed the card back without a word and pointed a manicured finger toward a private elevator bank, tucked behind a frosted glass partition. Ascending 50 floors took exactly 40 seconds. Maeve's stomach plummeted into her shoes, leaving a hollow, aching void in her chest. She rubbed her thumb against her index finger, feeling the rough edge of her scab. It was a grounding mechanism, a reminder that she was physical, real, and currently walking into the lion's den entirely voluntarily. Elevator doors chimed. They slid open to reveal a massive, open-concept floor that looked like the bridge of a silent ship. Heavy oak paneling absorbed the sound of her footsteps. The lighting was low, moody, and deliberate. Behind a massive desk of dark mahogany at the far end of the room sat Leo Rossi. He didn't look up when the doors opened. He was wearing a stark white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing thick forearms corded with muscle and faded, jagged scars. A pair of silver reading glasses sat low on the bridge of his crooked nose. He was signing a stack of documents with a heavy gold fountain pen. "You're 4 minutes early," he said. His voice was a low rumble, carrying effortlessly across the vast expanse of the office. The buses were running on a holiday schedule. Maeve stopped 10 feet from his desk. Her mouth was dry. Up close, in the harsh daylight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he looked even more exhausted than he had at the gala. Deep purple shadows bruised the skin under his eyes. Rossi finally looked up. He took off the glasses, tossing them onto the desk. He assessed her, his gaze sweeping over her sensible shoes, her dark slacks, and the cheap blazer. "Better," he murmured. He stood up, the sheer mass of him instantly dwarfing the massive desk. He walked over to a side table and picked up 3 thick, leather-bound ledgers. They looked heavy enough to crack a skull. He dropped them onto a smaller glass table, surrounded by 4 leather chairs in the corner of the room. "Shipping manifests," Rossi said, gesturing to the books. "Southern ports. We import olive oil, machinery parts, and textiles. Legitimate businesses that wash the money from the less legitimate ones." Maeve walked over, hovering by the chairs. She could smell his cologne now. The same ozone and tobacco scent from the alley, but mixed with the sharp, clean smell of heavily starched cotton. "And the leak?" she asked, keeping her voice strictly professional. $3 million over the last 2 fiscal quarters, Rossi stated, pouring a glass of water from a crystal carafe and sliding it across the table toward her. "My accountants tell me it's inflation, spoilage, increased tariffs." "You don't believe them?" "I believe in math," Rossi countered, leaning against the glass table, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Math doesn't have an ego. Math doesn't skim off the top to pay for a mistress in South Beach. If the numbers are bleeding, someone cut the vein." Maeve looked down at the dark leather of the top ledger. The gold-embossed dates stared back at her. This was cartel money, blood money. If she found the leak, she wouldn't be securing a bonus for a corporate team. She would be signing a death warrant. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached out and traced the spine of the book. "Are you afraid, Maeve?" His question was quiet. It lacked judgment. "Yes," she answered honestly. Lying to a man who could read heart rates from across a room seemed entirely pointless. "If I find the missing money, what happens to the person who took it?" "That is none of your concern." "It becomes my concern the second I draw a red circle around their name." Maeve finally looked up, meeting his muddy hazel eyes. She expected to see anger. She saw only a heavy, crushing gravity. "Your concern," Rossi said, pushing off the table and stepping into her personal space, is the $400,000 your father owes me. Your concern is the fact that you are currently standing in my office, doing a job that keeps his kneecaps intact. Do not confuse yourself with a judge, Maeve. You are an auditor. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against the sleeve of her blazer. Sit down. Drink the water. Find my money. He walked away, returning to his massive desk. He didn't look back. Maeve let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She pulled out the leather chair, sat down, and opened the first book. The smell of old paper and ink washed over her. It was a familiar smell. A safe smell. She picked up a mechanical pencil, and she started to dig. Hours dissolved into a blur of numbers, columns, and fading sunlight. Silence in the massive office was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic scratch of Maeve's pencil, the turning of heavy parchment pages, and the occasional, muffled chime of Rossi's secure phone. He never took calls on speaker. He spoke in low, clipped Italian, his tone never rising above a dangerous murmur. Maeve didn't take a break. Her bladder ached, and a dull, throbbing headache had taken root at the base of her skull, but a strange, hyper-focused adrenaline had hijacked her nervous system. The books were perfect. That was the first problem. Legitimate warehouse ledgers were never perfect. They were messy. Inventory got dropped. Forklifts ran over crates. Rats ate grain. A perfectly balanced ledger in a physical import business was the mathematical equivalent of a crime scene wiped clean with bleach. It was too clean. Rain lashed violently against the glass behind her. The sky over the city had turned the color of a bruised plum. Eat. A white porcelain plate slid onto the glass table, covering her notes. The sharp, overwhelming smell of roasted garlic, seared steak, and rosemary hit her nose, making her stomach contract violently. Maeve blinked, looking up. The room was dark, illuminated only by the warm, amber glow of a few brass desk lamps. Rossi was standing beside her, holding a matching plate and two heavy crystal tumblers filled with amber liquid. "What time is it?" she croaked. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "8:30, Rossi said, sitting in the chair directly across from her. He pushed one of the tumblers toward her. "Drink it. It will help the headache." Maeve looked at the whiskey. She hesitated, then picked it up and took a small sip. It burned like liquid fire going down, blooming into a heavy, intoxicating warmth in her chest. She picked up a fork and practically inhaled a piece of the steak. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Rossi watched her eat. He didn't touch his own food. He just leaned back, swirling the whiskey in his glass, watching her with that same intense, unblinking focus. "You found something," he stated. Maeve swallowed, wiping her mouth with a linen napkin. The food had grounded her, bringing her brain back online. She looked down at the 3 pages of dense, scribbled notes she had compiled. "Your accountants are idiots," she said. A tiny, dark spark of amusement flared in Rossi's eyes. "Enlighten me." "They're looking at the big-ticket items," Maeve explained, pulling her notepad out from under the plate. She tapped the end of her pencil against the paper. "They're auditing the heavy machinery, the imported cars, the bulk textiles. But whoever is stealing from you isn't taking entire shipping containers of sports cars. That's too loud. They're stealing from the dirt." Rossi leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass table. "The agricultural imports." "Exactly." Maeve flipped open the second ledger, pointing to a column of neat, black ink. "Olive oil, bulk citrus, and floral imports. It's a volume game. You import 10,000 crates of oranges from Sicily. The ledger says 2,000 crates spoiled in transit due to a faulty refrigeration unit on the cargo ship. The insurance writes it off as a loss. The books balance perfectly. But the refrigeration unit wasn't faulty, Rossi murmured, his voice dropping dangerously low. No, Maeve shook her head. Because I cross-referenced the maintenance logs for those specific vessels. The units were serviced a week before departure. There was no spoilage. The 2,000 crates arrived perfectly fine. So where did they go? They were sold off-book the second they hit the docks in Miami, Maeve said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was speaking the language of thieves to the king of them. Cash transactions, untraceable. The money never enters the holding company's accounts. It just disappears into someone's pocket. And because agricultural goods are perishable, nobody questions a 20% loss rate. It's genius, honestly. Rossi didn't speak. He stared at the ledger. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating, completely devoid of the faint, dark amusement from a moment ago. The air pressure seemed to drop. "Show me the floral imports," he demanded softly. Maeve's stomach turned over. She flipped to the back of the book. "Here. South American orchids, highly perishable, high margin. The spoilage rates reported here are astronomical. 40% loss on 3 separate shipments last month alone." Rossi's finger, thick and scarred, traced the line of ink on the page. He stopped at the signature at the bottom of the manifest, the man who had signed off on the spoiled inventory. Dominic Vitti. "Dominic," Rossi whispered. It wasn't an angry sound. It was the sound of a heavy, rusted vault door clicking shut. Maeve knew the name. Everyone in the South End knew the name. Dominic Vitti was Rossi's underboss, the man who ran the docks. A man who was supposed to be as loyal as a hunting dog. She watched Rossi process the betrayal. He didn't throw his glass. He didn't yell. The terrifying stillness that settled over him was infinitely worse. He looked like a man standing over a grave he was about to fill. "Are you absolutely certain of these numbers, Maeve?" he asked. His eyes met hers. They were entirely black now, the muddy hazel swallowed by blown-out pupils. "I balance the books for a floral warehouse," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "I know exactly how long an orchid can survive in a shipping container. Those flowers didn't die, Rossi. They were sold." He stared at her for a long, terrible second. Then he slowly nodded. "Eat your dinner," he said. He stood up, picked up his secure phone from the desk, and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning his back to her as he dialed. 30 minutes passed. Rossi hadn't spoken since he made the call. He stood by the window, staring out at the rain-slicked city lights, a dark, immovable silhouette against the storm. Maeve couldn't eat another bite. The steak tasted like ash in her mouth. She pushed the plate away, her hands shaking slightly in her lap. She had done it. She had found the leak. She had secured her father's pathetic life. But as she sat in the dim, oppressive quiet of the office, the reality of her actions crashed into her. She hadn't just solved a math problem. She had aimed a weapon. The secure elevator chimed. The sound was shockingly loud in the silent room. Maeve jumped, her chair squeaking against the hardwood floor. The doors slid open. 2 men walked out. They were wearing dark raincoats, their hair plastered to their skulls. Between them, stumbling and bleeding from a split lip, was Dominic Vitti. Maeve clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling a gasp. Dominic's expensive suit was ruined, soaked with rain and mud. His eyes were wide, darting frantically around the room until they landed on the back of Rossi's head. "Boss!" Dominic wheezed, his voice panicked and wet. "Leo, I swear to God, I don't know what this is about. They just grabbed me from the restaurant." Rossi turned slowly from the window. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, terribly bored. He walked past Dominic, ignoring the man's frantic pleading, and walked straight to the glass table where Maeve sat frozen. He picked up the ledger she had been working on. He carried it over to Dominic. He held it up, displaying the page with the orchid shipments. 40% spoilage, Dom, Rossi said. His voice was a conversational murmur. On 3 consecutive shipments. Dominic's face drained of all color, leaving him looking like a wax corpse under the dim lights. The refrigeration was fully operational, Rossi interrupted smoothly. I know, because the girl sitting in that chair just spent the last 9 hours dismantling your pathetic, greedy little side hustle. Dominic's panicked gaze snapped to Maeve. Pure, unfiltered hatred flared in his eyes. Her? You're taking the word of a drunk's daughter? A warehouse rat? She doesn't know shit. Rossi didn't hit him. He just looked at the 2 men holding Dominic. One of the men reached into his coat. No! Maeve screamed, scrambling out of her chair. The heavy leather seat tipped backward, crashing onto the floor. Rossi, don't! You don't have to do this here! Rossi held up a single hand. The man in the coat froze. Dominic was shaking violently now, sobbing, his knees giving out so that he hung, suspended by the grips of the 2 guards. Rossi turned to look at Maeve. She was panting, her chest heaving, tears of sheer terror pricking the corners of her eyes. You found the rot, Maeve, Rossi said, his voice terrifyingly gentle. You don't cure rot by ignoring it. You cut it out. Then cut it out somewhere else, she pleaded, her voice cracking. I'm an accountant. I'm not a butcher. Please. She wasn't begging for Dominic's life. She knew the man was already dead. She was begging for her own sanity. She couldn't watch a man die over a spreadsheet she had audited. Rossi stared at her. He looked at her trembling hands, her pale face, the sheer, desperate humanity of her panic. Slowly the tension drained from his broad shoulders. He looked back at his men. Take him to the docks, Rossi ordered flatly. Put him in a container. Let him see how long he lasts without refrigeration. Leo, please! Leo! Dominic screamed as the men dragged him backward toward the elevator. The door slid shut, cutting off his frantic begging with a heavy metallic seal. The silence rushed back into the room, louder and more deafening than before. Maeve stood paralyzed behind the glass table. Her legs felt like water. She reached out, gripping the edge of the glass tight enough to turn her knuckles white, just trying to stay upright. Rossi walked slowly back to the table. He picked up the heavy leather chair she had knocked over and set it right. He didn't sit down. He stood in front of her, closing the distance until the toes of his expensive shoes touched the scuffed leather of her loafers. He reached out. Maeve flinched violently, closing her eyes, but his hands didn't grab her neck. His thick, rough fingers gently grasped her trembling wrists, prying her death grip off the edge of the glass table. His hands were incredibly warm. Breathe, he commanded softly. She opened her eyes. He was standing inches away, his massive frame completely blocking out the storm outside. You just killed him, she whispered, a tear finally spilling over and tracking hotly down her cold cheek. He killed himself the second he stole from me, Rossi corrected, his thumbs rubbing slow, steady circles over the fragile pulse points of her wrists. You just handed me the shovel. I don't want this, she choked out, trying to pull her hands away. But his grip, while gentle, was entirely unbreakable. I don't want to be part of this. It's too late for that, Rossi murmured. He let go of her wrists, sliding his hands up her forearms to grip her shoulders. He pulled her slightly closer, forcing her to look up at him. You walked out of that ballroom with me. You sat at my table. You tore apart my empire with a pencil and 3 pages of notes. He leaned down, his mouth hovering just inches from her ear. The smell of tobacco and ozone wrapped around her, suffocating and completely intoxicating. Your father's debt is clear, Rossi whispered, the gravel in his voice vibrating against her skin. But you work for me now. You belong to the numbers, Maeve, and the numbers belong to me. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. There was no romance there. No soft, predictable fairy tale ending. It was a contract signed in blood and red ink. It was terrifying. It was dark. And as Maeve looked up at the monster who had finally seen her worth, she realized, with a sickening, cynical thrill, she had absolutely no intention of running away. That's how a debt gets paid in the shadows. Maeve just crossed a line she can never uncross, and Rossi isn't letting his new favorite weapon out of his sight. If you loved the dark, gritty tension of this cold-blooded romance, do not leave without hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Share this video with anyone who craves Mafia stories where the heroine fights with her brain, not just her beauty. Want to see what happens on Maeve's second day at the office? Drop a comment below and let us know. See you in the dark.